Let's move on. Let's talk about the intended learning outcomes. The intended learning outcomes is a major concept in the OBE. The intended learning outcomes, ILO in short, specify the activity that the student should engage in if they are to achieve the intended outcome as well as the content the activity refers to. This has got to be very well formulated. What's our task as teachers? The teacher's tasks are to set up a learning environment that encourages the students to perform those learning activities and to assess student performances against the intended learning outcomes. Again, we are talking here about alignment with activities and learning outcomes, intended learning outcomes. Activities aligned with intended learning outcomes. The ILOs tell the students precisely not only what they are supposed to be learning, but how and to what standard. What they are supposed to be learning is the content. How they are going to learn this content is the methodology or teaching delivery, instructional delivery. And to what standard, of course, has to do with assessing what they have attained or acquired as to the standard, as per the standard. Did they reach the standard? Did they go beyond the standard? Did they underperform vis-a-vis the standard? All right. Now, I'm presenting to you here a framework for assessment, so to speak, that we follow in the classroom. Teachers, if you will look at number 1, teachers are supposed to have a very clear picture of the graduate attributes. If you will look at the syllabi of teachers teaching in higher educational institutions, the first few pages there contain the mission and vision of the institution, mission and vision, goals, the goals of the program, or the institutional intended learning outcomes. So it's defined already by the institution. The next, if you will look at again our framework, the next is the development of program intended learning outcomes with graduate attributes built in. So having a very clear picture of the graduate of Aquinas University taking CPT are supposed to be able to show the following attributes. It's the number 1. The students taking CPT in Aquinas University should be able to demonstrate, the graduates should be able to demonstrate this, and this. That's the intended learning outcomes, or the program intended learning outcomes, the ILOs, so to speak. And the third stage is the development of the design courses that address the ILOs. So in other words, the course like this one that you're taking, assessment of student learning, must be aligned with the ILOs, which are supposed to be aligned with the ILOs. Okay, having said that, myself, as a teacher of assessment of learning 1, should be able to design my course aligned with all of this. So, how shall I do this? The development of the course intended learning outcomes, or the ILOs, must clearly state what the outcomes of completing the course after you shall have done assessment of learning 1 and 2. What should you be able to do? That should be very clear in my mind and in your mind. So development course intended learning outcomes should clearly state, or which clearly states what the outcomes of completing the course are intended to be in terms of your ability to do something. Okay, I cannot do much about this because of COVID-19. We have to make do with this kind of teaching. Video recording passed on to you. That's all that we can do. There's really no substitute. For me, there's really no substitute for a face-to-face instruction because the interaction is so active in an actual classroom. I'm lecturing, you stop me because you have a question to ask. I welcome that. If you stop me when I'm lecturing, that means that you're listening. And I welcome that very much. So it's easy. The feedback is so easy when we are in the classroom. Right now, I don't know. Perhaps some of you are drowsing, listening to me. Some of you are doing something else, listening to me. You probably will just say, anyway, you will be given a lecture through USB or whatever means. So you probably are multitasking. Anyway, as I said, we can't do anything about this situation now. You have to make do with this kind of instruction that's happening now. All right. In the course design also, the design must contain appropriate assessment tasks, or ATs, which assess the performance of the students against the silos. Course intended learning outcomes. So all the assessment that I will be doing, as far as you're concerned, as far as this course is concerned, should be aligned with the learning outcomes or intended learning outcomes that I have so specified in my syllabus. I'll repeat: design appropriate assessment tasks which assess the performance of students against the silos. And finally, I should devise a criterion reference grading system to assess students' achievement. So the achievement of the students will not be assessed against the performance of others, but against your performance rather, assessed against the standard set for you to achieve. That's what we mean by criterion reference grading system. Now the course design must be guided by what we talked about earlier, constructive alignment framework, if you remember that. Okay, so this is the framework for assessment. If you need some more clarification, what are you going to do? You're going to email me. All right. Here is now how we write intended learning outcomes. You have to be you have to very seriously take this. Writing of intended learning outcomes. As I said earlier, in basic education, these are already prepared. The intended or ILOs are already prepared for you by the curriculum makers in the DepEd. However, some of you will be teaching in college, so you will be preparing this in coordination with your department chair, respective department chairs. So you should learn how to write intended learning outcomes very well. So let's try to learn. What are the three essential components of a learning outcome? What's the picture of a learning outcome? What must it consist? All right. Here are the three essential components of a learning outcome. First, it has to have a verb. Anong verb? You learned it in high school, in elementary. A verb is an action word, a verb that indicates what the learner is expected to be able to do at the end of the period of learning. So after 1 hour, after 2 hours, after 3 meetings, what should the learner be able to do? That should be spelled out. You have to think of a verb that is observable. You can see it, you can sense it. Because an observable verb or action word is something that you can measure. If you can sense it, then you can measure it. That is what matters, when we think about writing intended learning outcomes. Okay, another essential component is it has to have a word or words, phrase, that indicate on what or with what the learner is acting, without the help of, with the aid of. So with what will the learner be acting? If the outcome is about skills, then the word or words may describe the way the skills is performed. Like jump up and down competently. Competently. What's the action word? Jumping up and down. So the way the skill is performed should be well stated. Another essential component is a word or words that indicate the nature, or in context or in terms of standard, the nature of the performance required as evidence that the learning was achieved. Remember these three essential components. You will understand this better with examples, of course. A verb that indicates what the learner is expected to be able to do. A word or words that indicate on what or with what the learner is acting. And a word or words that indicate the nature of the performance required. As what? As evidence that the learning was achieved. Let's look at some examples later. Okay. I'm done with this. Okay, assessing learning. Let's have a very clear picture of how we assess learning. And this is the framework to do that. There is a need for us to have a very clear understanding of the process of assessment. We look at assessment both as a process and as a product, so it should be very clear to us what the process of assessment consist of. We cannot be talking about this process unless we know the purpose of doing the assessment. So again, it's very clear for us, why are we assessing? If you only link assessment to grading purposes, there's only one of the many purposes of assessment, which we will try to see as we go along. So as we proceed, we need to be clear also about three connecting or interrelated concepts, which are assessment, measurement, and evaluation. I will explain that as we go along. So the key terms to understand here are, again, assessment, measurement, and evaluation. Are they one and the same? Of course, as you can see in the framework, they are not one and the same, but they are interrelated. Now, what is assessment as it impinges on the instructional process? In other words, assessment in the instructional process. What is its place in the instructional process? Okay? So we need to understand placement assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessments. Key terms that at the end of this course, you should be able to identify, distinguish one from each, and these should form part of the jargon of the course. So nobody who has taken up assessment of learning should be able, or should be, how do you call this? Should be mistaken. Hmm? Should have a misconception of placement, formative assessment, and summative assessment. We leave this course with these terms very clear in our minds. What else must we need to understand in assessment? Assessment is a planned process. We need to plan it even before planning. Take note, even before planning the methods or the instructional delivery, we must already have a plan of how we are going to attain and measure the attainment of objectives. So objectives, plan for assessing these objectives. Plan for letting us know that the students have successfully achieved the objectives. Plan. Okay. So, we define educational outcomes clearly, accurately, precisely. We also classify the educational outcomes. We have simple outcomes. We have very complex outcomes. So the outcomes come in gradation, no? Simple to complex. That's why we have what we call hierarchy of educational objectives, which we shall take up later. And we need also to develop criteria. Up to what level would we call satisfactory attainment of outcome? Unsatisfactory, beyond satisfactory. We have to have a definition of these, the extent of achievement of the outcomes. We have also to be very clear about what measurement options we are going to use. We have here selected response measures, free response measures. These two are covered by what we call traditional assessment. Take note, selected response measures and free response measures. These are what we tackle in assessment of learning 1. What about the next two? Performance assessment and learning portfolios or learner portfolios. These are tackled in assessment of learning 2, which we call alternative assessment. So for the first day of our lecture, we will concentrate on selected response measures and free response measures, and what shall we do after we shall have collected the answers of the students. How do we interpret them and how do we transform them into grades is covered by the first day of lecture. The second day of lecture will be how do we design performance assessment and learner portfolios. All of these are very important in the teaching learning process of the OBE type. What's OBE again? Outcomes based education. All right. The first box there is about our need to understand assessment. So, when we teach, like I do now, and every day we go to school considering or assuming that we are in a regular classroom already, when we teach, when we face our students, we make daily decisions about the progress of our learners. Progress of our learners on one hand, and about the effectiveness of our instruction. So we look into our learners and our own teaching when we make daily decisions. They even say the teachers must always be alert because teachers, according to some renowned educators, teachers must think on their toes. They don't know what they're going to meet in the classroom, what situations they're going to face in the classroom. So even if you have a very well planned lesson and something happens inside the classroom, you may even have to forget altogether that lesson because you will have to respond to the immediate situation. So, one of the very important skills that a teacher must possess is decision making. What shall I do? If this thing happen, if that thing happen, what must I do? So a teacher thinks on her toes or his toes. Now, our decisions, the decisions that we make daily, must be based on sound evidence of the progress of learning. Sound evidence of the progress of learning. If I have in my class one student who cannot learn for one reason or another, we cannot leave that student behind. So sabi nga ng batas, no one must be left behind. So we must do something about that student that is being left behind by his or her classmates. Now, what's wrong with the child? It is our accountability that all of the students put on our shoulders. The responsibility, the accountability of everyone's learning is ours as teachers. So all our decisions about each of our students must be based on sound evidence. So we must collect evidences of learning every opportunity we have. What are these evidences of learning? How do we collect them? All right. Just talking with the student informally or formally is collecting evidence already. Just listening to them talk, you will pick up something about that student, whether that student is learning or not. how much learning he has in terms of the many misconceptions or correct conceptions he has. You can get this from informal talks or formal talks with the child. Observation of what the child is doing is evidence of learning. So it's not only tests that we give to the students that evidence learning. No, there are many, many ways. That's why we have what we call traditional way of collecting evidence and then alternative ways of collecting evidence. We will take this up one by one. Okay. These evidences are supposed to be informing us or giving us feedback of the progress of learning. Is it at pace with what we want, with the standards that we expect of a class? Is the learning that's happening at pace with that standard? Or are the students in general underperforming? Or are they performing beyond our expectation? All the reasons have got to be studied by us. All these reasons must be unearthed by us. So, in fact, a teacher must be a researcher in practice. Okay, because collection of evidences is, in fact, research in a way. So, what do we call this process of collection of evidences? Simply, it's called assessment. Therefore, assessment is simply collection of evidences. Evidences of what? Evidences of learning. So clear na tayo, ano, what assessment is. Simply, it's collection of evidences of learning. Okay. These evidences that we shall have collected when we do assessment are needed for various educational decisions. And what are these types of decisions that we teachers have to make, the principals, the department heads, etc., have to make in relation to the progress of our students, in relation to the welfare of our students? Okay, let's start with the very important decision, which is mainly ours as teachers. And this is instructional decisions. Instructional decisions, by definitions, are the everyday decisions made by us teachers. And we call this formative assessment. We make this every day in our classroom, from the moment we enter the classroom up to when we exit the classroom, we make decisions. And we call this instructional decisions. Before we leave the classroom, we already have in mind, what is it that I'm going to teach tomorrow? Must I repeat my teaching because I found my students to be underperforming? They did not reach the standard that is set by DepEd. So what am I going to do? Which part of my lesson must I repeat? These are examples of instructional decisions. All right, another classroom decision that the teacher makes is grading decisions. Oh, there are many teachers who are put in difficult circumstances when it comes to grading, because parents, especially parents who know, parents who know what grades are for, parents who are, how shall we call, very much concerned about grades their children get. So there are parents who go to you to complain. You should be able to answer them with the what? Evidences. So it's very important that we collect evidences every day in the classroom. Grading decisions. we have to be fair to our students. Students hate teachers who are unfair. So we must be made, grades must be made judiciously. Since, as I said earlier, since teachers may be called on to defend their decisions to students, parents, or other stakeholders. The teacher, okay, before I move on, okay, think on this. I'll give you a situation. Suppose a student, a very brilliant student, you only gave a grade of 90, but this student thinks of himself as having attained fully what you were expecting from him, the standards. So he always gets 100 in the test. He recites frequently. He makes very good performance assessments, etc. So he thinks he deserves better than 90. So suppose that student comes to you and asks you, Mom, Sir, what did I not do to get a grade of 95? What else must have I done which I did not do? That's why you gave me only 90 instead of 95. I expected 95. All right. So you are hard put to explain the shortage. Do you have evidences to show that this student fell short because he lacked this, he lacked that, and so on? Again, evidences. Without those, you would be hard put to defend your decision. So, what's the highest grade that one can get according to DepEd? Is it not 100? So what do we expect from a student who gets a grade of 90 only instead of 100? Ano pa ang kulang? Ano pa ang deficiency niya? Because he fell short of some 10 points. Evidences. You should be able to say to the student, I am expecting sana ganito, ganon. Hindi mo nagawa yun, etc., etc. If you can defend judiciously the decision that you have made, then fine. No? Otherwise, you might find yourself in hot waters. Okay, so the teacher who is most likely to be able to defend the grades that are assigned will be the teacher. Dapat kayo yon, ha? Will be the teacher who, firstly, adheres to an acceptable grading policy. Who develops this grading policy? Kayo, the teachers. You come together and develop the grading policy approved by the school administrators. All right. Adhere to this policy. Perhaps you will not go wrong. Okay. The teacher also who uses data obtained through multiple, take note of the word, through multiple appropriate measurement instruments, not just a single instrument, but a number of instruments. So, this instrument says, confirmed by this another instrument, confirmed by this another instrument, all together will say you only deserve a 90 instead of a 95. All right? Multiple, not just a single source, but multiple. Appropriate, because if it's not, the instrument that you have used is not appropriate, then the grade that you have given is not valid. Okay. Who else? The teacher who can defend the grades are those who know the uses and limitations of such data. If you use only one source of or one evidence like periodical test, yun lang. Hmm. Nothing else. Okay. Then in fact, you are only grading one aspect of the total person, total personality of the child, total achievement of the child. Probably it's only what he can recall of what you have taught. Is that all that you need to consider when you grade? All right, so when you make use of various, or I should say here, multiple sources of data, one source is, I mean, the what do you call this? The results of the various sources are additive. No, one is compensated by the other, and together, when you pull them together, you come up with an aggregate grade. Then it is, it should be better than just a grade taken from one source. More, shall we say, more more valid, the fact that it's taken from several sources, more reliable, the fact that again it's used just more than one instrument, more objective, and therefore defensible grades. Okay. Limitations of such data. Knows the uses and limitations of such data. Limitation ng test lang ay ganito. Limitation ng scaled responses, yung mga rubrics na yan, ano ang limitation yan? It could be subjective, unless the criteria are very well defined. I will try to explain this as we go along in the alternative assessment. So we should know the limitations of each of the instruments that we use for basing our grades. Ulit po natin, instructional decision, grading decision. Whose decisions are this? The teachers. No? So this is the province of classroom assessment. Diagnostic decisions. Diagnostic decisions are those made about a student's strengths and weaknesses and the reasons for them. The purpose of diagnostic assessment is to probe for specific causes of failure. So diagnostic is more about learning about the weaknesses of students. Of course, it's good also to look at the students' strengths, because we can capitalize on these strengths, for one reason or another, for one purpose or another. We will go to that later. But when we do diagnostic test or we give diagnostic tests, it's more for the students who are at risk of failing, because we would want to see their specific weaknesses so we can do something about these weaknesses to help the students not fail. Okay, let me talk about diagnostic. It's difficult to construct tests. So if I'm handling grade 4, what could I use as diagnostic test before I start my grade 4 lessons? Let's say mathematics. I need to give them something upon which I can base. What am I going to teach? Where shall I start? Should I start right away from what DepEd says I should start as a grade 4 teacher? I need to know where the students are, because that is one basic assessment principle. You should know where the students are according to Osabel, know where the students are and start from there. So you don't start really from what DepEd says. You start here because you are a grade 4 teacher, you start here. What if a grade 4 teacher starts doon talaga sa sinasabi ng how do you call this, DepEd? Ito ang content. Ito ang performance, no? What if the class given to you is only a grade 2 level as far as performance is concerned? What will you do? If you teach the content performance standard for the grade 4 straight away, what do you think is going to happen? You will meet frustration. The students will meet frustration. Both of you will be frustrated. Okay, so what is needed? What is the sound principle to apply? Know where the students are, meaning give them a test first to know where they are. Okay, so use the grade 3 achievement test as a diagnostic test if you don't want to construct a diagnostic test anymore. Assuming, of course, that the achievement test in grade 3 is valid, because that test will tell you the weaknesses of the students, the incoming grade 4 students. What if you find, in general, what the class given to you is only up to a grade 2 level? Certainly you cannot start with a grade 4 content and performance standard. So what shall we do? What will you do? You'll think of a bridging program. A bridging program. You need to bridge what they know with what they are expected to know at grade 4. So you bridge the knowledge gap. How will you do that? That's your own strategy. If the gap is serious, talagang serious, you cannot on your own do it. So you need the help of the principal, you need the help of the parents, etc. What will you do? Perhaps you can report the performance of the students to your principal, and the principal will call, let's say, a parents' conference to report where the students are. And let the parents help you, because to do it by yourself maybe would be a serious task, a serious burden on your part. So let the parents help, let the school help. Do not take it on upon your shoulder, to bridge that huge gap in knowledge. You need the help. You need the collaborative effort of all the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Of course, your principal, your co-teachers, the parents, all of these are stakeholders of education of the children. So you need their help. To what? To bridge the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap is determined by the diagnostic test that you are going to give. Oh, is that clear? Okay. Now, you have found out that the students are short of so much in terms of knowledge. You are not just going to stop there, but you are going to look for the reason for the inadequate performance or the gap or the failure. Reasons. What's that? That's research. Okay? So, it's very important. Whose work is this to do diagnostic? Teacher pa rin, di ba? All right. Although with the help probably of a guidance counselor, if you have a guidance counselor in your school. Usually, the guidance counselors assigned in schools are teachers who don't really have enough or sufficient training to do guidance and counseling. because not all schools have guidance counselors. This is a very important position that should be filled up in school. If indeed we want to help our students, we need an honest to goodness guidance counselor. All right, let's move on. Selection decisions. Selection decisions involve test data used in part for accepting or rejecting applicants for admission into a group, program, or institutions. You might say, sabi ninyo dapat walang nire-reject. Oh, but there are certain schools, for example, like Science High Schools, Legazpi City Science High School, Regional Science High School in Goa, etc. These are highly selective institutions of their students. So they give tests to select. There are schools that have special classes, like special classes in sports and athletics, special classes in science and mathematics. Not everyone who want to get into these classes are accepted. They have to go through a test, a selection process, and usually the selection process is through tests. So selection decisions are made. And these are educational decisions, probably not within the province of a teacher. But the diagnostic decision, you should be part of that. Let's go to placement decisions. Placement decisions are made after an individual has been accepted into a program. They involve determining where in a program someone is best suited to begin work. Kaya nga, placed. You are placed in an appropriate group. Let's talk about homogeneous grouping and heterogeneous grouping in schools. Of course, schools are mandated to use heterogeneous grouping. What do we mean by heterogeneous grouping? Another word for that is mixed ability grouping. You don't group students who are all bright in one class, section 1. The next bright student, section 2. And the dumbest, I'm sorry, maybe it's not an appropriate, politically appropriate term to use, no? Hindi natin ginagamit ang salitang dumb or stupid to describe students. Okay, so let's just say they are underperforming. Underperforming because of one reason or another, but they're not dumb. So we don't have classes for them, special classes. Maybe we can construct special classes for them, but not a permanent one. Maybe for mathematics, for example, some of the students at grade 4 don't even know how to add or subtract. So we can group them together to have a special instruction for them. But for sectioning purposes, no. They are probably pulled out for special tutorial classes, and then they are moved as they get to the level, the ability level that they are supposed to, then they are moved again to the regular classes. So there is such a thing as pull-out program. Maybe you have 1 or 2 students in your class that are too advanced. If you mix them with the whole class, for certain lessons that they are so advanced already, what do you think will happen to them? They'll get so bored. They'll cause trouble. So what do we do? Maybe a pull-out program can be arranged for them. They're pulled out and then given to a teacher who can give them appropriate instruction so that they will not be stunted. So this is a strategy that the school can adopt to address or in response to what we call differentiation of learning, addressing the diversity of learners. We have to accept that in a particular school, learners are of diverse ability. So We cannot give them instruction that we describe as one instruction that fits all. No. But we have to differentiate the learning to really address the needs of these diverse students. Okay? So placement decisions are made in school to what? To address the diversity of the students or the learners. Okay. Counseling and guidance decisions involve the use of test data to help recommend programs of study that are likely to be appropriate for the student. So, if you have a guidance and counseling office, one of the things that you expect to find there are test materials, graduated test materials for varied learners. Test materials not only for testing the achievement of the students along academic, no, but tests of multiple intelligences of students. I I don't know if there's a school rich enough to have tests that will identify the multiple intelligences of students. If I were a counseling and guidance teacher, I'm going on my own to look for these kinds of tests so that I can serve my students or pupils or learners well enough. Let's go to program or curriculum decisions. So these decisions are usually made at the school district level after an evaluation study comparing two or more programs has been completed. Meaning, suppose you have a program designed by somebody, no, has done his master's or doctoral, and proposing to you that this program is going to work for these kinds of learners. No? Those who cannot read very well may benefit from this kind of program. Okay, so you would want to test this in addition to a traditional way of reading, traditional way of teaching reading. All right, so it's a program or curriculum decision that has to be made at the school district level. So here are two classes, one taught in the traditional way and another class taught in the traditional way plus something, plus an intervention that's going to help students read better. Okay? Now, if you find in this research, you find that it works very well, then maybe you can, as a principal, suggest this to be adopted in your school. You see again the importance of doing research at the school level. We call this action research. And when teachers do this, they get points for doing action research. What are action research for? These are for resolving problems prevalently existing in your school. Because you have to do something about these problems. Okay, so if I were you, you'll think of doing action research. No? Again, that is going to earn you points. Anyway, curriculum, program, or curriculum decisions, that's not the province of the teacher, but of the school principals, probably department heads, and so on. Okay. We also have administrative policy decisions. These are decisions that have impact most directly on students. What are these two decisions that have impact on students? Promotion decisions and graduation decisions. Who are to be promoted? Who are to be retained? Who are to be graduated? Okay? Promotion, whether a student's score is at or above the cutoff, etc., etc. Now, this is clearly spelled out in, take note of this. Can you please write in your notebook? Because you need this, no? Department Order number 8. Department Order number 8, series of 2015. Department Order number 8, series of 2015. Look, or how do you call this? You have to, this is uploaded by DepEd, so you are going to download this. You need this as part of your collection of, how do you call this? Very important documents. This should form part of your collection of very important documents. I mentioned earlier about Code of Ethics. You have to have a copy of that. Magna Carta for school teachers, you have to have a copy for that. And then I'm saying now you need to have a copy of, what did I say? Department Order number 8, series of 2015. Okay. If you master that, you will not have any problem at all in assessing or doing classroom assessment. I'll tell you. If you master that, so kinakailangan talagang i-master ninyo, no? You can already answer a few questions probably in the let. So have a copy of that. You need it for your own teaching practice. Okay. Promotion, graduation decision is, of course, a school's decision, administration's decision. Okay. Let's go to the purposes of assessment. This is the second box in our framework. Here are a few of the purposes of assessment. Assessment is used for more than one purpose. It's not just grading purpose, but many more. What do we mean by classroom assessment? Which is, of course, your province as teachers, our province as teachers. Classroom assessment is an ongoing process. Kung process yan, di may steps, ano? An ongoing process of identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting quantitative and qualitative information about what learners know and can do. I think this is a very clear definition of what classroom assessment is. Primero, it's a process consisting of identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting. Two kinds of data, quantitative and qualitative. Example of quantitative is scores in tests. Right. Examples of qualitative, the rubrics. Although rubrics, meron siyang kaakibat na quantity, no? Especially if the rubrics are, how do you call this, scaled. Of course, we have also what we call holistic rubrics. So qualitative information usually are transformed into quantitative as well. So quantitative and qualitative information, an example of qualitative information, you're familiar, of course, with anecdotal records. What are these? Narratives about behaviors, unusual behaviors of students. These are words, qualitative information. So quantitative plus qualitative would be a holistic, will give you a holistic picture of what the child know and can do. And this is what is expected of us teachers. Now, the purposes of assessment may be categorized into two. Let's look at this type of classroom assessment. Formative assessment. Formative assessment refers to the ongoing forms of assessment that are closely linked to the learning process. Characteristically, formative assessment is informal and intended to help students identify strengths and weaknesses in order to learn from assessment experience. Take note, intended to help students identify strengths and weaknesses. Who will identify the strengths and weaknesses? Who will? According to this, intended to help students identify strengths and weaknesses. Me as teacher, kasama ako. Students, kasama sila. Most importantly, the student should be able to identify their own strengths and weaknesses. That's why self-assessment is a major component of classroom assessment in the K-12 curriculum. Before, ng panahon namin, hindi naman kami pinapa-assess ng aming mga progreso. Lahat ay ginagawa ng teacher, but not anymore. Now, students are expected to assess themselves. That's why, anong tawag natin dyan? Self-assessment. Okay. Now, let's look at this, no? May tinatawag tayong assessment for learning. May tinatawag tayong assessment as learning. At meron din tayong tinatawag na assessment of learning. For, as, of. Different prepositions in between assessment and learning. They mean differently. No? So, assessment, please take note of this kasi maraming ulit na itong lumabas sa let. Ano? Differentiation between assessment for, assessment as, and assessment of learning. Now, assessment for learning. Why is this done? Assessment for learning is done so the teachers can make adjustments in their instructions. So at the end of the lesson, the teacher gives a formative assessment and sees the students, barely half of them got satisfactory rating. So what can the teacher do? Right? The teacher must make adjustments in their instruction. So that when the teacher does it, the teacher is doing assessment for learning. All right. I hope you are having your notebooks with you. No, because this is not in my lecture, but it's very important. Decision that has to be made by teachers after a formative assessment has been done. So at the end of the lesson, you gave a 10-item test about what you taught. If 75%, take note, if 75% of the class got 75% correct in the test, what's 75%? That's between 7 to 8 scores out of 10. Okay, let's put it at 7. If the students, 75% of them got 7 out of 10, 7 out of 10. Actually, it's supposed to be 7.5, no? Pero tanggalin na natin yung 5, no? Now, what is 75% of, let's say the class is 50 students. What's 75% of that? I think it's 37. Let me. 50 students times 75. Okay. 37. If 37 of your students out of 50 got 7 correct items, ulit, 75% of 75%, then you can say, my teaching has been successful. So successful teaching or satisfactory learning means 75% of the class getting 75% of the test items given. That's satisfactory. What's your decision, instructional decision? Move on to the next lesson. Move on to the next lesson. Otherwise, under that, you cannot. That's according to DepEd, huh? All right. If the class got 41, between 41% to 74%, take note, 41% to 74%, then your decision must be to reinforce your teaching. Reinforce your teaching. Ano yung 40%, etc. Yun ang tinatawag po natin na Mastery Performance Level, MPL. MPL, Mastery Performance Level. Paano natin kinukuha yan? Okay? Take note. MPL, Mastery Performance Level. How do we get that? Firstly, we need to get the mean score. So, 10 plus 10 plus 5 plus 6, etc. And then add up all those 50 scores, get the mean or get the average. Suppose ang average is 6. 6. Nakuha mo na ang mean, 6. Divide that by the total number of test items. Ilan ang test items? 10. So, 6 divided by 10 is 0.6 or 60%. Is that satisfactory? Of course it's not. Huh? So, what is your decision? Your decision must be to reinforce your teaching. Hahanapin mo, alin doon sa 10 ang hindi nakuha ng mga bata. Ulitin yon. Doon lang, ha? Yung hindi nakuha ng mga bata, yun ang uulitin mo. Alright. Ang tawag po natin dyan ay reinforcing teaching. Okay. What if the MPL reach only 39, short of 40? So, 40 or lower MPL means you have to reteach the lesson. Hindi ka mag-move to another lesson, but you will have to reteach the lesson. Kasi failure yung pagtuturo mo. Hindi natutunan ng mga bata ang itinuro mo. So, uulitin mo ang pagtuturo. Ulit ha, malaking bagay ito na dapat ninyong maunawaan. Right. Formative test tells the teachers to what? To make adjustments in their instruction. So kung ang instruction mo ay unsatisfactory, nakarating lang sa 40% or under ang MPL ng iyong estudyante, kinakailangang ulitin mo ang decision mo, ang instructional decision para sa inyo ay ulitin mo ang pagtuturo. On the other hand, mataas-taas naman dyan. Let's say 50. MPL of 50. Hindi mo kinakailangan ulitin lahat. Ang uulitin mo lang yung hindi nakuha ng mga bata. So we call that enhancing or reinforcing teaching. On the other hand, kung nakakuha ang mga bata ng 75% and above, then you can move on to the next lesson. Maliwanag po. Uulitin natin paano ang pagkuha ng MPL. Kunin ang mean ng buong klase. Kunin lahat ng scores, i-add and divide by the number of students you have who took that test. Pag nakuha mo ang mean, i-divide mo ng ano? Ng number of items. Halimbawa, kung ang mean ng klase ay 15 out of 20. 15 out of 20. So, 15 divided by 20. Kasi yun ang number of items. You will get 0.75 or 75%. Ano ang decision mo? Punta ka na sa susunod na lesson. Kasi satisfactory yung performance ng mga bata. Maliwanag po. That is formative assessment. That is assessment for learning. So the teachers can make adjustments in their instruction. Let's go to assessment as learning. In assessment as learning, students reflect on their own progress. Meaning, nagsi-self-assess ang mga estudyante. Students reflect on their own progress. And these may be given at any time during the teaching and learning process. Assessment as learning is also a way to check the effectiveness of instruction. Maliwanag po. Ha? Okay. Ulit. Ang formative assessment po ay characteristically informal. Ano po ang pinaka-objeto nito? Makita ang strengths and weaknesses of the students. Ang teacher ay gumagawa ng tinatawag na assessment for learning para sa kanyang consumption. Feedback para sa kanya kung ano ang kanyang gagawin. Ako ba ay mag-uulit ng pagtuturo o ako ba ay magtuturo na ng susunod na lesson? You make adjustments. And this is the role of formative assessment, which we call assessment for learning. Pag sinabi nating assessment as learning, ini-involve po natin dyan ang mga estudyante sa pag-assess ng kanilang sarili, sa progreso ng kanilang pagkatuto. Self-assessment. All right, let's go to the next. Formative assessment also involves teachers using evidence about what learners know and can do to improve their teaching or to make instructional decisions. All right, how can the teacher do this? The teachers observe, and based on their observations, guide the learners in their task through interaction and dialogue. So dapat you have to have an open communication with your students. Palagi kayong nag-uusap. Hindi palaging pinagagalitan ng mga estudyante. Kung di nag-uusap kayo, pinag-uusapan ninyo kung paano ka higit na makakatulong sa kanila. Now, if you do that, then you're doing a good job as a teacher. Because a teacher is supposed to be not just a classroom manager, not just a facilitator of learning, but a teacher is also a guidance counselor, a mentor. You have multiple tasks, when you take on your role as a teacher. Now, teachers also record or monitor formative assessment by documenting and tracking learners' progress. So, bawat isang bata sa klase mo, meron kang card o meron kang envelope, doon nakasulat, saan na ba, nag-i-improve ba ang bata o nagre-retrogress, etc. So, meron ka rin na record ng bawat isa sa kanila, aside from your record notebook. You have to have a record of whether the student is progressing or retrogressing in their studies. Now, take note of the next one. No? It says here, formative assessment results are not included in the computation of summative assessment. So in other words, it's not for grading purposes that you give formative assessment. Not included in the computation of summative assessment. So para kanino po ang formative assessment? Mainly for the students' information about their progress, so they can do something about it on their own, and mainly for you as teachers, feedback about the students' progress, so you can also do something about your students. So, for decision, for instructional decision, not for grading purposes. Informative assessments, teachers recommend how students might improve their learning. O yan na yung guidance counseling function mo, ano? Teachers recommend how students might improve their learning. Ngayon, meron kang 50 o kaya may higit pa 70 students, no? You cannot help all of them. You cannot. It's not humanly possible for you to be able to do that. But does that mean that you're not going to help them anymore? Hindi po. Marami kayong makakatulong para tulungan ang bata. Mainly, ang magulang. That's the reason why you call parents for a teacher-parent conference. You don't call the parents for a teacher-parent conference to ask contribution. You need to confer with them, mainly to help their children. Okay po ba? So, patawag po. O kung hindi mo kaya talaga na magbahay-bahay para puntahan ang kanilang mga anak, huwag ka nang magbahay-bahay. Patawag na lang sila. Pero mas maganda kung nagbabahay-bahay pa para makikita mo ang kalagayan ng iyong mga anak, ng iyong mga bata, para hindi mo silang pinagagalitan, no? Nakita mo ang kalagayan nila sa buhay. So you probably will become a little bit tolerant, a little bit accommodating of their behavior, no? So maganda yung nakikita natin ang kalagayan ng mga bata sa kanilang tahanan. So maganda talaga yung nagbabahay-bahay tayo para tingnan ang kalagayan ng mga anak natin na itiniwala sa atin. Okay, pero kung hindi kaya din, anong tatawagin natin o anong gagawin natin? Tatawagan natin ang ating mga magulang.